Jonathan Anderson, when you first met Luca Guadagnino years ago, I'm assuming now, did you ever imagine you guys would have two movies, Challengers and Queer, out in the same year?
I wouldn't, it would never have crossed my mind at all. It has been such a surreal year, you know. Um, when I met Luca and years ago, I never imagined that we would have done this. And I don't know, it's a bit of a dream come true for me because, when you were able to work with like one of your best friends and make his dreams come true and make it all kind of come to life, it is kind of slightly surreal. I'm still trying to piece together this year.
Well, when you met all those years ago, was this ever like brought up, like discussed, like, hey, one day, like, you
Uh,
designed clothes for my films?
I think he was like, he had suggested that, that we would work together one day. And I think, when someone says it, you're just like, sure, it was a bit kind of, and then we just became very good friends over the years. And then I think it was just before the pandemic, we were about to do a project and then it didn't happen. And then suddenly Challengers came up. And then I was like, the pandemic had happened. I was like, well, why not? Like, what have I got to lose? I have no idea how I'm going to do this, but we'll make it happen.
I love that Challengers was your first film together because I love tennis and I love all your work in it, and I felt like you really captured like tennis gear and tennis kits. And I know you have a history of Uniqlo and Roger Federer as well, but how familiar were you with tennis going into the movie?
I grew up in a family which was all about rugby. So for me, tennis was never on my radar. Like I know some people are obsessed by tennis, and me and Luca were kind of joking that like we didn't really know anything about tennis. But it was amazing that when you start to research something that you don't know enough about, how obsessed you become. It's like Justin Christgis, how he came to the script is so fascinating. Do you know what I mean? It's this idea that, when you do become obsessed by something that you had no knowledge of, and then you become, a fan. Um, I don't know. I think for me, it was like, delving into something that it is foreign to you is actually really, I think, sometimes quite good because I think you come in it with naive eyes. You're kind of like you're seeing things in a different way. And I don't know, I found it really fun actually. It was sort of like so not on my radar that I became completely hooked with like the perfection of finding the technicality of what that should be.
Hmm. Yeah, and Luca, yeah, for sure. He's said in the past like this is not a tennis movie. It's a movie about people. So,
Yeah.
but did you also look at the tennis kits the same way?
I did actually because I worked with Uniqlo and designing stuff for tennis, and I had completely like detached from this whole thing. And no, I think what I like about working with Luca is it is all about the psychological act. So in a weird way, you are looking at what is the kind of notion that you're giving about the world that you're entering in when you walk into the cinema. And for me, I became really obsessed by this idea of, I work in fashion. So, and I work in these big brands. And I was thinking of like, when you get off an airplane in America, it is amazing how we are so immune to the idea of the brand. Or when we watch anything to do with sports on television, it is brand. And there's so many brands that they become nearly obsolete because they are part of the patchwork of everything. And that's why when me and Luca were working, we were like thinking like it's good that we don't take any endorsement from anyone. We have control over what you see in this world. Do you know what I mean? And the psychology of what brand means. It's this idea of like why Uniqlo is being used and why like Juicy Couture in one period in the early 2000s was a thing. It was like the idea of Abercrombie and Fitch. It was the birth of uh, teenage angst in the early 2000s, So for me, it was like an interesting period in clothing, like queer. It's like two interesting moments I find in fashion that are quite subtle because like in Challengers, you're looking at nearly the birth of capitalism, really, of a new type of capitalism in fashion, with younger people being uh, hooked by image that is ultimately means status. And you see in Tashi's character how status changes over the
It's
years.
about power with her and
Like
like the I
power.
told you shirt. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think this is what I think what I love about my job and what it's such a dream, you know, like this year I've been kind of like wow, like um is that clothing has so many meanings. And it's not until you do a film that you realize how much meaning clothing has. Because you've got to get an audience to be able to like see the character straight away in this like 2 hour, 3 hour film. It's like you need to be able to like know where you are so that and work with the actor so that you're giving them the kind of like confidence as well of like and knowledge that they have that they want to bring to that character.
Yeah, for sure. And you could really clock all three of them immediately. Like you said, like Tashi was all about power, and then she lost her all of her potential endorsement deals with her injury, right? Like that's like an
Yeah.
undercurrent in the movie. And now she's like living vicariously through art. He's still active. He's all dressed in Uniqlo. And
Yeah,
Patrick,
and
he's rich but a journeyman, and he's like running low on money, so he's just using old clothes during the
yeah,
endorsements, you know?
yeah, and I think what is interesting about it is that, you know, it's like Patrick, there is a psychology about the aloofness that only nearly comes through wealth somehow. You know what I mean? Sort of like there is a nonchalance. It is like there is a cockiness that ultimately, no matter what you wear, you just ooze appeal. And whereas art becomes this sort of like archetype. It is like nearly like a kind of a vehicle of like the precision of like the precision of tennis, you know, this sort of like, you know, togetherness
And it's also
ultimately.
his game too, right? He has
Yeah.
like the perfect game, the one-handed backhand. He has like the quote
Yeah,
normal
and
serve.
of course, and I think what, you know, I think for me, it's sort of like, you know, when you're looking at a contemporary piece of costume design, is you're trying to um, I actually think it's actually incredibly difficult, actually, because I only realized this by going into historical period film like queer, is that within challengers you have to kind of like take something that exists in a very short period of time of history and make you realize that you are getting history in a flashback that is so accurate that you feel that you're in that period. So it was quite hard. And when you're doing it for the first time, you're kind of like you become very conscious of trying to really dive into the research on that part because it's sort of like it's easier said than done ultimately. What I realized then after doing Queer, which is in the 1940s and 50s, where you are kind of it's like more kind of like you're going back in time. There's this, but when you're dealing with a period when I was like, you know, I was at high school in the 2000s. You know, I remember the birth of Abercrombie and Fitch. I remember like the obsession over Juicy Couture. I remember those moments, you know.
Mhm.
So it was kind of like an odder experience because you're trying to find newness in something you've already lived, you know.
Yeah. I think I guess also with like contemporary fashion, like challengers too, like modern fashion, like there's with the audience is like they're more likely to latch onto something like that I told you shirt. Like did you ever expect like people be like, I want one, you know?
Yeah, this I never saw coming. You know, I was like, I had already planned that we would like remake the t-shirt because I've always loved that image of JFK Jr. And I had a plan that I wanted to do it as a kind of creative exercise. I had no idea that it was going to be able to be bootlegged globally. And people, like, I was walking down streets in New York and I was like, this is what is going on? Like, what's happening?
This is your impact. This is what you did. So,
And it was really fascinating. It was like, it was so interesting to watch. I think that's the power of this film. This is why I think Luca is such a genius, is that like it transcends off the screen. Like this is been the most remarkable thing about the film. It
mhm.
is like it has gone into the subculture, you know, and
Yeah.
this I find you can't even control. This just happens, you know. It's just something you just don't imagine.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I definitely want to get to queer, and like you said, like that's obviously period, and Challengers is modern. But I felt like some of the fashions, especially that Drew wears, is kind of modern too. Like that sheer shirt.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
like what kind of research did you do into the 50s and specifically like I guess expats in Mexico in the 50s and
Yeah, well, you
fashion
know,
at
I
the time?
think I have always been obsessed by this moment. Pre-war for me is like one of the most fascinating moments in menswear fashion because it is the birth of the industrial suit. You know, it's like the war happens and then suddenly everyone is liberated. Like, there's this like growth spurt in industrial practices in fashion. And but you still have this idea of the classicism, you know. So for me, for queer, everything had to be original. I wanted everything from the period, the underwear, the sock, everything had to be original. And I wanted it to be singular pieces, so that's all they wore, you know. So it was no duplications. It was very kind of like this is the linen suit. As it ages throughout the film, it will age through the process, you know. Um, and I love this part because I think as a fashion designer, you know, for me in men's in the 50s just has this amazing moment because it's so the fabrications in the 50s are just they're very difficult to reproduce today. We don't have looms that do some of the things that they existed. And when I look at Allerton, for example, like we found a series of three suits that used to belong to one person that I had found and they are so contemporary. Like it's like the see-through shirt. It was they were like dead stock that I found from the 50s. That they were like leisure shirts. You bought them in, they came in packs of three. And I loved how strange they were, but they are from the period. And you kind of realize sometimes we think we're so modern, but some of these things were already part of the public domain.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. And like I also love like Daniel's suit and like what you're saying before, like how it gets darker as the movie goes on, and it starts out as like white and cream, and it kind of mirrors like his descent into like drugs and
Mm.
alcohol, and also like his obsession with Allerton. And I guess like as a fashion designer for film, it's like what's like telling a story like a character story through fashion, which is something you don't really do in your day job. It's just the runway, right? It's like here's the look.
Well, it's like the most ultimate luxury, ultimately, to me, because you are creating something that will transcend time because it's encapsulated in a cinematic moment. You know, it's sort of like it's very hard to do that in fashion, you know, because you have these genius people who are in front of you who are morphing into characters. You've got Luca, per, like set design, prop design, score, music, all this collaboration to make this just remarkable piece of vision ultimately.
Yeah. So how much of the costumes were sourced from elsewhere, like vintage shops, and how much was original?
The only piece that was like made from scratch in the film is two moments. The necklace, which I created with a jeweler at Loewe. And because it was very, Luke had a very particular way that he wanted it. And the moment, the surrealist moment where they're both wearing the same suit
Hmm.
and where it's based on a Francis Alice image. And but the fabric of this of that we made the suits from is from the 50s. So The rest is all original. Background, everything.
Yeah. I do love like the surrealism of the film, and how did that impact like your work and your designs for those moments, like such as that one you were just talking about.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like I feel like after doing Queer, for example, I felt like I became very obsessed by Allerton in terms of like aesthetic, this idea of the perfection of someone, the idea that someone has like inner light in them, you know. Um, and this idea that the closer you get, then you start to see the flaws in the clothing. There's little holes on things. Things are moth-eaten. Things are starting to, it's all really perfect from a distance. And as you get closer, you start to, and I kind of started to be kind of into this when I was working on shows recently.
Well,
It's,
how did designing for films compare to your day job as a creative director for fashion houses?
well, it's sort of like, I think the one thing they have in common is it's about characterization. You're trying to tell a story. I feel when I do a fashion show, it's about telling a story. Um, but the big difference, I think, for me is it's about in fashion, I have all these people are running after me, and I have to be the boss. Whereas, like, I love that Luke is the boss, and then
Yes.
I'm there to do whatever he wants,
It's
whatever.
nice not to be the boss sometimes, right? You're just in service of someone
Yeah,
else's vision.
yeah, it's nice. I was like, for me going to Rome, I felt like I was like on like back at university learning everything from scratch again. I felt like I had to prove myself every day so that I didn't feel like people were like, this guy has no idea what he's doing. Do you know what I mean?
Well, you did, so. Well, lastly, when's the next collab between you and Luca?
I don't know. Let's see. I think there's a few projects in the pipeline,
I
so
know he's got a lot of things lined up, so
lots of things. So you'll have to stay tuned.
okay. Well, Jonathan, it was great speaking with you. Thanks so much for your time, and
No,
congratulations
you're more than
again on
welcome.
both your films.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and have a great holiday, bit of
You
time
too.
off.